All right, I guess it's 3 o'clock, isn't it? Okay. Oh man, I gotta say, 3 o'clock on a Friday is hard. I was like, I'm actually just ready to go home. But I guess I'll go teach class. And I see that a few of your peers probably thought the same, except they're not teaching; they're just not here, and that's okay. Okay. So very quickly, kind of agenda for today. So we are going to take a look at a couple of other practice questions. This one, I gave you some last time that had a whole bunch of kind of details, what different kind of grades of answer look like. I don't have as much of that today. I just have some practice questions, and we'll just sort of talk through how you might answer them. We'll do that pretty quickly. We'll keep going on education as well, and hopefully make it most of the way through that so that we can, just punt, the ball across the line on Monday and do a little bit more exam prep. And then Wednesday is the exam. So, all right, what readings should you do for the exam? So we got 3, right? So all the readings from Postman that I have, I think it's chapters 1 to 4. I can't remember if it's Haywood or Hayward. I think, hang on. Was it Hayward? I always get his name mixed up. Haywood. Like I always want to say Hayward. They're all on the syllabus. Haywood, and then we'll say Twenge, and that chapter out of the book Generations, right? That's on the syllabus. Okay, and I realize that some of them got a little bit mixed up for education and work. I'll have to go fix those. I don't know why they got mixed up on my table, but I'll fix those. But focus on those 3 for the readings. Yay, I finally answered that question. Okay, I'll get back to those these questions in a sec, because we were talking about this for education, but because people were feeling nervous, I want to look at a couple of practice questions, right? So this was a question on the test a couple of years ago, right? I have, because this class is always changing a little bit. Every year I rewrite, half a dozen questions on each exam because it's from a question bank. It draws on, I think, about 20 questions per exam. you get 5 of them. So this was a question a couple of years ago, which I took out and has now become practice fodder as things go. Okay, so this question, right? Define the term emerging adult. Right, so that's really easy. And I used to have the breakdown on here. Usually I have this as 3, 3, and then 4, right? So first part of the question, define the term emerging adult. When did the concept emerge, time period, or generational cohort? And then using material from any part of the course so far, suggest 2 reasons this category has become necessary for sociologists, right? So that would be, 4 marks, 2 for each example that you give. Okay, so this question is really pretty straightforward, right? So here you would define emerging adult, right? So what is it? Well, basically, as I've given, in the course, it's people roughly 19 to about 29. It kind of coincides with the term young adult, right? So that one's easy for 3 marks. When did the concept emerge, time period, or generational cohort? I don't know if I mentioned it in this class, but we started using it for the millennials, right? And again, this question is not on the exam, so don't worry too much about it. So we started using it for the millennials specifically. If I was to rewrite this question, I would add a Y in here. That's probably why I took it out. And why? Well, because millennials were one of those generations that had started to grow up considerably slower, right? They grow up slower, and they hit adult markers later. So you could think things like, if you want to give an example of that, age at first marriage, right? That would be an example. For millennials, right? And if you want to get really specific, I always love this for full marks, right? You're talking, 28 for women and 30 for men. Okay. I get to write in shorthand. You don't get to write in shorthand for your answers. Also, I'm speaking them out, right? So this is, that first part of the question for about 6 marks. Okay, and then using material from any part of the course so far, suggest the reasons this category has become necessary. Okay, so here, maybe I'll just clear this part off so I have more space to write. So reasons that you could give. So you're going to have, there's no right and wrong. Well, I'm not going to say that. There's no particular right answer. There's a whole bunch of answers that you could pick for your reasons that we start to use this term. So you could talk about adolescence has gotten longer for millennials. So things like, oops, sorry, I'm writing badly. Say they have sex early, but those markers of adulthood, like marriage, home ownership, kids, career, all of these things happen considerably later. Okay? So all of those things happen considerably later, right? So to describe this period kind of between, after adolescence, but before they're really kind of doing those things that we would consider properly adult, you have this period of we start talking about emerging adulthood, right? You're emerging into adulthood, but it takes longer, right? So we hit those markers later. One of the things you could talk about too is things like, school, maybe because of, educational inflation, which we talked about last time, and your credentialism. right? It's taking longer, to get into the market, to enter the marketplace. So, I talked about this a little bit last time, right? In order to get into that basic kind of credential that you need just to function in the marketplace, just to get ahead, just essentially to, have the bare minimum, you need at least, now kind of a 4-year bachelor's degree or something equivalent, right? So it's taking longer and longer to get there. If you really want those great jobs, you maybe have to do a master's or a PhD, which pushes all of those other life achievements later, right? We'll talk about debt today, right? People are being saddled with debt, especially in the United States because of the cost of education, and that's pushing, all of their sort of life goals later and later, all those markers of adulthood later and later. So we now need a period to describe what happens, when you're legally an adult, but you haven't hit those markers of marriage, home, ownership, kids, career. You're in school for longer and all of that jazz. Okay. In our answers, is paraphrasing lecture material okay, or should we include things like according to X reading? Both things are okay. You can paraphrase the lecture material if you want, and you can also say according to X reading. Either one is okay. You can take either approach. All of that is fine. Do both. Do one, do both. All good there. Does that all make sense? Like for that answer? Okay. I'll try to plow through the next one so we can. Am I expecting citations? No, I'm not going to expect citations, right? Because you got 90 minutes to answer 5 questions. That's a pretty heavy lift. It doesn't give you a whole lot of time for each question. So I'm not expecting anything like proper citations, right? Plus, my favorite citation style is Chicago, and I think that one's the one that takes the longest. No, we're fine. Just get the information down, You can say according to the slides, according to the lectures, and that will be, or according to Haywood, or according to Postman, right? All good enough. I'll know where it came from. If you bring something in from outside the course, right, and you're like, I learned in, Psych 104, ... X, just tell me that you learned it there. So at least I know that if you're bringing something from outside, where it's coming from. We'll all pretend that you learned something in psychology classes. Sorry, I cannot stop myself. But just tell me that so it doesn't look like it's this like Chat GPT making up citations. If it looks really fuzzy, I'm gonna probably check them. So yes, just tell me like, hey, I learned this in SOS blah 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 381 or something like that, and I'm cool with that. Okay, next class on Monday we'll do a couple more, maybe this one. See, I have my breakdown here, which I'll have in the questions on your exam. So, how does Smith believe moral reasoning amongst millennials differs from moral reasoning amongst other generations? Pardon me. So, this one's easy. Millennials. Moral reasoning is equal to, what do we call it? We said moral consequentialism, right? So, here you probably, be a good idea, moral consequentialism, what's the definition? Well, it is basically, morality depends on, the consequences, right? Moral consequentialism, it's like what happens, whether it benefits someone, whether there's direct harm to other people that can be judged. So moral decisions end up being made, ad hoc, rather than being based on existing codes. Okay? And here, I know I talk, you can talk about different forms of ethics if you want, right? There's virtue ethics, there's deontology, all of which I defined, duty-based ethics, right? And how these contrast. You can if you want, right? If you want to give that rich detail, all good. More marks to you. These would be more typical of, say, the silents, the boomers, in particular, compared to the millennials, who are consequentialists. Okay, so that's the first part of the question. That's just defining moral, saying what they are and what moral consequentialism is. What now? This one, this is the one that used to really trip people up, which I think is why I took the question out, because people were getting tripped up by this. What key philosophical trends have contributed to this type of moral reasoning? So this was, postmodernism. Right, that was the big one. And I cited some key thinkers, right? We got my buddy Nietzsche, old Michel Foucault, who, if I had glasses, I think I could pull off a decent Michel Foucault impression. One person got that joke. There you go. And Jacques Derrida. It's about the hair, guys. Foucault and I have the same hair, the same barber, I think. Okay, so all of these, postmodernism, right? Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, right? And here it's like there is no, universal moral code. What's the term that I used? In the course, I'd have to go back. Cultural relativism, right? It's all cultural. There's cultural relativism. And everything is, socially constructed. So even morality ends up being that way. Right, so all this is, the dominant trend is postmodernism. And like I said, people have deeply absorbed the thinking of people like Nietzsche, Foucault, and Derrida without ever actually reading any of them, which means no universal code of ethics, no, set moral values. Everything's culturally relative and socially constructed, including morality. So everybody sort of has to make these decisions about morality based in the moment and largely attending to their feelings. Okay, I should check if there's a question there. Oh, grammar, spelling mistakes are fine. I mean, obviously, yeah, I'll still post the example slides that we go over for sure. I just haven't gotten there yet. I was trying to figure out how lockdown browser worked for most of the day and trying to get IST to answer a question. It didn't go well. Not for this class, for SOC 100, don't worry. I'm angry-ish. The optimism, not in terms of moral behavior, that's a different trend, or a different thing about millennials that Smith thinks. Grammar mistakes. Just do your best, try to keep it comprehensible, right? Like if you put in an or instead of an of, right? Whatever, I'll figure it out, I'm a smart guy. It might take me 2 more seconds to make sense of it. If it's so incomprehensible that, I can't understand what you're saying, that's going to be a problem. So do try to make sense. But a spelling mistake here. My favorite one is when people misspell people's names and the name is in the question. That one always makes me laugh. Don't try to make me laugh though, because it doesn't reflect well on you. But if you spell Smith with an E, like S-M-I-T-H-E, and it's up in the question, I will laugh at you secretly in my heart. Because it's funny, especially when it's in the question. So, try not to do that. Yes, I will still do that. All right, so I think that'll do. I've spread out the exam prep now over several lectures. Maybe I should answer these questions, because hang on, we'll go back to here and then I'll answer them. This is where we ended off on Wednesday, dear God. Wednesday feels like forever ago. We're talking about post-secondary education and the growth of demand for it, right? And we have a bunch of different sources. Just the fact that everybody needs it. We got that educational inflation and that credentialism. So to get those great, even good middle-class jobs at the kind of entry point in the labor market, you need a post-secondary education. And we have, pressure from people coming from developing nations who, whose economies also want this education, also need this level of education to enter that tier, but they don't have enough spaces in their countries, or their universities aren't prestigious enough. And then, more push for vocational training and people upgrading all kind of puts pressure on the post-secondary market. Okay, so that's where these two questions came from. Gap years. So I can say honestly, I haven't seen any data about gap years, and maybe I just haven't really looked. So I don't know if there's been an increase or not. I will say one of the things that I do know for this last part of the question, young men who take a gap year are considerably less likely to return, and even if they do return, they're less likely to complete a post-secondary degree. So again, there's kind of weird patterns there, but that's all I know about that. Why do so many Chinese, and Indian students go to U of A despite it not being as well known and prestigious? I can only speculate. I think, yeah, like any school, and U of A is relatively well recognized. Certainly we're not Harvard or the University of Toronto, but it's still a pretty good school. Top 5 in Canada. So it's relatively well recognized. Top 5 in Sustainable Development Goals. So, yeah, sorry. Yeah. We're doing great for that particular and odd metric. And yeah, I think like anything else, is where are you able to get in? What can you afford where can you afford to go? All of these sorts of things. What's permissive, and especially as countries like the US kind of lock down a little bit on international students, I imagine there's going to be more pressure in that direction. Who just showed? Oh, I know who showed up at my house. I'm like, oh, it's one of my children. I'm like, that's what happens when you have a video doorbell. I'm like, no one should be home yet, but actually it makes sense. Okay, so let's talk costs. One of the big issues is, you hear this especially out of the States, though it's obviously a concern in Canada as well, is that as it becomes more necessary, right? You need post-secondary in order to be able to get into even that lower tier of that middle class job market. People are sort of forced into a post-secondary education, even people who in the past maybe wouldn't have gotten one, right? People who would have just gone off to work and probably learned a trade or learned a skill or sort of apprenticed somewhere, they're sort of forced into the post-secondary market. Okay, now this is only true for those who actually can afford it, right? As the cost of education goes up, what we see is an increasing class divide, and you can sort of think of it as the education haves and the education have-nots. And there's a bunch of other divides in here as well, right? It's less prevalent in Canada, but certainly in the US, right, you have a sort of tier system of universities, right? At the top, you have the Ivies, or the Ivy League. And then you would have like your, elite schools that aren't Ivy League. So Ivies obviously are Harvard, Princeton, Yale, for some reason, Columbia, Brown. There's another one that I'm forgetting. I don't know. Oh, I think University of Pennsylvania is an Ivy. Right, so these are the really, really elite schools. Below that, you would have other schools like Duke University in North Carolina, Stanford, UCLA. I can't keep these things straight. Some of the state schools, like now I can't remember. I'm like, which are the really elite state schools? I can't remember. I want to say Ohio, but I could be wrong about that. Or places like University of Notre Dame, right? Some of the private religious schools. And then, lower tiered state schools, even lower tiered liberal arts colleges, and then, community colleges and other things like that. So depending on which one you go to also is a great measure of where you're going to end up, right? Obviously, everybody probably wants to go to an Ivy League school. Arguably, maybe the education is great at Harvard. I don't know, never been. But what is there is a lot of social capital, right? You get to connect with rich people, powerful people, and you yourself, can become a rich or powerful person from having attended there. But, it costs a lot of money to go to an Ivy League school. So in general, those with richer parents tend to go to university or college in the US. Those with even richer parents tend to go to elite schools or more highly tiered schools, especially if their parents or family give money to those schools, and that creates a whole bunch of interesting class divides, right? And it's not just rich and poor, it's also, especially in the US, the tiers. And as much as my friend Sean, loves to tell me how great University of Toronto is, Canada doesn't really have that, right? Whether you went to Queen's or U of A or Calgary or Dalhousie or even the vaunted halls of the University of Toronto or McGill, sorry, I guess I'm bragging on U of T, it's a good school, or, McGill or whatever it happens to be. Generally a university education at a well-recognized Canadian university is treated the same across the country. Okay, now, average debt loads, we're talking here, in Canada, range from somewhere around 20, leaving about 20,000 for university. For a lower tier, like a community college or a regional college, something like Red Deer Polytech, you're looking at about 13,000. That's average debt loads for undergraduates. In the US, right, it varies incredibly depending on where you go. You can get away with pretty cheap education in the US, right? Especially, say, if you go to a state college in a state where you are a resident, right? Expensive by Canadian standards, but still not crazy. Community college, about $4,000 a year as of 2020. So those numbers are a little out of date, but I couldn't find more up-to-date ones. A state college for state residents, a year of tuition is about $26,800. For non-residents, just shy of $45,000. When you get into your private non-profit colleges, so something like Duke or University of Notre Dame would be there. You're looking at tuitions north of $50,000, right? And that's where you're getting into, the upper tiers. When you're talking Ivy League schools, talking tuitions in the $65,000 range. Now, most people who go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton, Yale is in New Haven, Connecticut. I think outside of Yale itself, about 4 people live in New Haven who don't also attend Yale. So there's really no one who just like, well, since I'm here, since I live in New Haven, I'll just go to Yale. It doesn't really work like that. So almost everybody is paying, for living expenses to live on campus or around campus. So you're looking at average kind of somewhere between 60 and, in some cases even up to $100,000 a year to attend an Ivy League school, right? So once you include books and all the living expenses. So, by the way, if you thought your tuition at U of A was bad, right? You're not exactly going to Yale or Harvard, but imagine spending $100,000 a year for your education and walking away with a cool $500,000 worth of debt when you finish your undergraduate degree, right? So that is fun. So especially in the US, this means that a lot of young people start out their working lives with these huge debt loads. This is why there's been really kind of pitched arguments in the US around things like debt relief for students, right? Or for people paying off student loans. It's like, look, we want our young professionals to do things like move into adulthood, have children, get married, and it's hard to do some of those things when you're $500,000 in debt. Now again, the average debt load is not that big for the most part in the US, but it can be hundreds of thousands of dollars even if you didn't go to Harvard. I didn't say it with my fake New England accent that time. Okay. So yeah, life goals and other kind of markers of adulthood often get put on the back burner. Now, that said, the bulk of student debt in the US is held by a very small cadre of individuals. And the bulk of them are people that go, like the ones who hold the most student debt are those that go on to take master's degrees. And if you exclude them, it's not quite as crazy, right? You don't have like $100,000 debt loads for a lot of people. There are some people, right, they go on to take masters, especially in the liberal arts, that do then struggle. So it's not exactly, everybody walks away with $200,000-$300,000 worth of debt. But as the cost of college really increases in the US and has for decades gone up faster than the rate of inflation, people are stuck with these student loans. Okay, now, theoretically, this might not be the biggest problem, except for one thing in the US. So in the US, student debt is non-dischargeable. So what that means is you cannot get rid of it. So even if you go bankrupt, right, you could declare bankruptcy in the US 17 times and you are still stuck with your student loans. Because one of the things that the US government did in order to basically make it so the banking sector would give out more student loans so more people would go to college is they changed the laws. And they basically said, okay, as part of this bargain, you give out the student loans, give out lots of them, and we'll make sure that you are whole at the end of the day, because we will make sure that people cannot discharge that debt, right? So you can't just go to college, rack up hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, declare bankruptcy, and be cleared of that debt. In the US, you're actually stuck with that debt forever. Now, Canada is a little bit different. Canada, student debt is dischargeable in bankruptcy, but only after 7 years following the end of the last year in which that person attended any type of schooling. So the idea here is, right, for 7 years, you absolutely have to pay, any money on student loans that you had. Again, the same idea that, in a sense, educating you is a risky business because, you come away with a degree, which is great, but the bank can't then come back and repo your degree, right? It's not like they can be like, all right, it's like you buy a car, they can take the car back and get some money back. If you have a mortgage, you stop paying, they can take your house and sell it. Your degree is worthless, not to you, but just to the bank. And so it's a risky financial bet. So the Canadian government was like, well, we'll make sure you get paid for at least 7 years. And in large part, people should have mostly paid off their debt 7 years after, or, largely paid off most of their debt within 7 years of leaving school. So, used to be that the federal government, kind of did this themselves. They administered the student loan program. Increasingly, they turned it over in the 2000s to the 5 big banks. So your Royal Bank, your TD, your Bank of Montreal, your Scotia, and your CIBC, who administer most of the student loans in Canada. And if you don't pay, they send their collection agencies after you. So that is kind of the story. And again, a bit of a problem because you sort of need that. In our kind of service-based post-industrial economy, you need education to stay in the middle class, right? Okay, so in the US, this is our sort of trajectory. And sorry, I'm just checking how many slides I have left so I know how to pace myself here. All right, so here's our trajectory, right? Cost, grants, and loans for US undergraduates, in 2019 dollars, and measured between 1964 and 2019. So this is a weird measure, right? So if you transported even, how much college cost in the 1960s to today's dollars, right, it would have cost, about $8,000. And today, in today's money, it's about $20,000. So you see, right, the cost of it has more than doubled, in that kind of 80-year-ish or 60-year period. Sorry, I can do math. 60-year period. And the amount of grants and loans available has not necessarily kept pace either. So people are stuck, paying, and you have to say, the joke is always about your college, saving in your kid's college fund. Why? Because, it's going to cost a whole ton of money to educate that kid. So if you want to think like slow life plan, right? We talked about this with Twangy. This represents, right up here, a ton of resources, like a huge ton of resources that parents have to invest in their children, right? You want your children to do well, so you need to invest in them. And one of the outputs of that is fewer children. Because even, outside of the richest of rich parents, and even then, only the exceptionally rich have more kids than the average. We'll talk about that later in the course. To get your kids, across the finish line into a kind of successful adulthood where they're doing okay is expensive, right? It's going to involve a ton of parental sacrifice, investment of resource and time and all of that. So people have fewer children as a result, according to this idea of the slow life plan. Okay. Haha. Off topic. I don't know if I have time for off topic. Can I say anything about the potential strike that may happen for the university? I know as much as you do. All I know that you don't know is that the university apparently gave the professors union a new offer, which they were like, okay, so they counter offered. So the strike is temporarily postponed until the whole thing breaks down again tomorrow, I presume. But we had a bargaining meeting so they would inform us what's going on. And they're like, we can't tell you anything. It's now a big secret. So that's all I know. And how will it affect students? Well, I mean, you'll get fucked over as usual. That's sort of, how to put this kindly. You want to know what your position in this is? You're the pawns, right? You're the ones who get sacrificed so professors can make more money or so the university can stick it to their own employees. Does neither side really care about you? I care. I'm not entirely sure that Oshawa cares, and I'm pretty sure the university doesn't care. So yeah, you're pawns in our game. I just want you to know, I don't make that much money. You can look it up. I'm not on the salary disclosure list because I don't make enough. So, don't hate me. Just a poor, corrupt professor. How does it decide what schools are more prestigious than others? Is it just grades, getting a job after, or I take it there's a second part of that question. Okay, well, a lot of this has to do with history, right? Some of the oldest schools are the most prestigious. Who goes there matters a ton. It's those super well-connected rich people, especially in the US, that makes it more prestigious. That long history tends to make it more prestigious as well, right? Is the University of Toronto so much better than here? Probably not, but it's the oldest university in Canada, and apparently that means something. Certainly it does to my friend Sean. Silly Sean, the butt of all my jokes. He's a really good guy. I like him. Just weirdly reminds me every time we talk that he went to University of Toronto. And I mean, it's just kind of like, what we decide is important. Again, what place has the most money, right? Harvard has like a bazillion-dollar endowment. Places like Notre Dame, have tons of private backers, owing to their history. So there's a lot of that. Would you still be teaching, or would there be a small gap? So if, I'm assuming this has to do with the strike, if there's a strike, I can't teach. They're going to cut off my access to everything, right? And I presume the buildings will be locked. But I can't teach. I can't even get into my email. They will lock everything down the moment a strike is declared. So, I won't be able to do anything. So, extra little unpaid vacation for me. How many questions from each lecture? I'll get back to you on that one. I have to count because typically, I'll tell you next time. Roughly speaking, right? Education's gonna. I would say we'll have one question because it's the shortest unit, and probably two each from history of youth and childhood and generations. So there, I figured it out. I don't need to tell you next time. I told you now. Okay. I think I answered all of this. What tier would Juilliard be considered? I mean, Juilliard is prestigious in its way, but it's kind of an art school, and that's what it's known for the most. It's not Ivy League, but it's probably in that upper tier. I'd have to look. But yeah, everybody who wants to dance wants to go to Juilliard, apparently. Okay. So, all right, here I am. All right. 12 whole minutes. What a luxury. Educational inflation. All right. As more people are educated, right, and I talked about this last time, education becomes less valuable. And this is just a straight supply-demand kind of equation, right? There's more supply. One of the things, and this is definitely true in Canada, and certainly true in Alberta, is that we used to have a pretty tiered kind of level of education, right? So we used to have sort of a university degree granting tier, right? Degree granting was, U of A, U of C, and U of L. And then below that, you had sort of non-degree granting colleges, right? But they could grant certificates. So you had, Grant MacEwan, now MacEwan University, Mount Royal, and the King's University College, and a couple others. And then you had, some stuff below that, like Red Deer College, Grand Prairie Regional College. Now what sort of happened in the 2000s is the governments, and this happened all over Canada, decided that, we know that people who have a degree from a university tend to make more money. So what we need is more universities. So basically, they took all of these places, right, that used to be, you could use them as a 2-year program towards a degree granting university or get like a 2-year certificate or something, and they're like, we're going to turn all of these into universities. And they all became degree granting institutions. And so now what you have, in Edmonton, you used to have one degree granting institution and maybe 3 or 4 certificate and transfer program systems. And now essentially you have 4 degree granting universities. Well, does Concordia count? I guess it will. So we have U of A, MacEwan, the King's University, and Concordia University of Edmonton, all of which are degree granting. So what that did was increase the supply of degrees, right? Of university bachelor's level degrees. And in essence, it sort of tanked the value of such a thing because for whatever reasons, employers don't really make a big distinction between a U of A degree and a MacEwan University degree. And I'm not saying they should, just because MacEwan is a glorified high school. I'm kidding. I have lots of friends who teach there. I'm just joking. Back in the day when it was Grant MacEwan Community College, it was a glorified high school. It's much nicer now, I promise. And there's some great scholars there. But I got to get my own shots in. There's increasingly, a ton of supply, and demand hasn't kept up, right? There are still employers looking for people with university degrees, but now there's just so many of them out there. So your degree is, declining in value, unfortunately. So in the mid-20th century, right? Mid-20th century to the late 90s, right? Basically, a BA pretty much promised you a high status job, right, in the service industry. And your high school diploma was your base credential. Today, right, arguably, a master's is the new bachelor's degree, right? And the bachelor's, unfortunately, and I'm sorry to tell you this, is the new high school diploma in a lot of ways, right? So, master's degree is what a bachelor's degree was 20 years ago. A PhD is what a master's was 20 years ago. And even for myself, I never got a postdoctoral fellowship because after, 9 years of grad school, I was ready to not be at the mercy of psychotic professors anymore. I was ready to be one. But, increasingly people say, and this is true, if you're going to get those great jobs in academia, right, you're going to get that tenure track position that all the professors are looking for, which I did not get. I'm a teaching professor. You needed to do 1 or maybe 2 postdoctoral fellowships. Our most recent hires in the department, Lindsay Bing, who's a criminologist, did 2 postdoctoral fellowships. So a further 4 years after completing a PhD, right? So the postdoc, or 2, is the new PhD. This is educational inflation. It's more and more education to get those top tier kind of jobs. All right, so How am I doing for time? Hang on, any questions? How depressing. Oh, yes. Your Grand Prairie hatred is noted. Okay, so let's talk social class. We talk academic attainment, right, and eventual employment are strongly tied to family background, right? And it's things like every additional year of school parents have means a 5% greater likelihood their children will attend and complete university. The reasons for this are pretty clear. Parents who went to university will tend to think education is important. To the degree that they succeed in life, they will attribute it to that education, and they then push their kids to get those same kind of qualifications so that they too can thrive, right? And they have the resources to make it happen, right? Children from higher income backgrounds tend to have better literacy rates. We'll talk about family structure later on in the course and what that has to do with it, because family structure plays a huge role as well. The richer you are, the more likely you are to be really, really engaged with your kids because you have the time. And especially if you're married, you're able to split that responsibility between two parents, right? So you can kind of shift off engagement as you have energy and time. So it tends to be, richer people tend to be married more often, right? Not like more often. They are married. I'm just going to say the same thing again. The higher you are up in the socioeconomic bracket, the more likely it is that you are going to get married and remain married, and you pass this kind of advantage on to your kids by just having that time and those economic resources, especially if both parents work. Upper income parents also have more social capital, right? They're able to make connections for their kids, right? By people they know. They know lots of really well-connected people who run engineering companies, people who can open doors for their kids, get them that internship at the law fair, and that social capital, again, they use those social resources for the benefit of their children. And yeah, there's a pretty strong argument that upper income parents do a more consistent job of teaching their kids how to interact with the adult world. And you can see, Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, for this. They're more likely to, encourage their kids in all sorts of ways. When we talk about religion, we'll talk about this as well. One of the things that religious communities do really well is building the ability of young people to develop social and cultural capital. And largely, again, there's an income component to that as well. And upper income parents foster the qualities and interests of their children, right? Why do I have to run off every Thursday to drive my daughter to her horseback riding lessons? Well, because I'm foolish and let my daughter take horseback riding lessons because I wanted to own a horse for some reason. I don't yet, but it seems inevitable. She's very persuasive for a 15-year-old. But right, you find the things that your kids are good at and you build those qualities and you invest the capital, social, cultural, and economic that you have in, helping your kid be the best hockey player, the best violinist, the best, the one that goes to programming camp and all of that fun stuff. Okay, so credentialism. We talked about this as well, right? Our high school diploma, became our base credential. I don't know why this slide is taking credentialism. This is a bad title for this slide. I'll think of something else. All right, so let's talk kind of breakdowns, right? More Gen Xers are college educated. It's even more for millennials, and Gen Z is going to be even more. Now, as a proportion, though, fewer and fewer of them are going into humanities especially. There's about half as many students studying in the humanities today as there were in 1990, right? So, despite a growth in overall undergraduate enrollment, there's half as many people studying the humanities today as there were in Canada as there were in 1990. So the humanities have been devastated. The social sciences, not quite as badly, but still, it's a declining kind of sector. And we know this, like we look at sociology here at U of A, and we see is, year on year, we're having trouble attracting students to the program, right? So we've broadly seen this trend. It starts in the 1980s and it continues. I remember why I titled this slide Credentialism. What people are interested in increasingly when they get an undergraduate education is a credential that's going to get them a job. And one of the things that the humanities and social sciences don't necessarily do super well is translate into the workplace, right? They're a decent base credential showing that you're smart enough to complete a degree, but when you're looking for a credential that gets you a job, they don't do a great job of that. No one, as someone who had a major in English in my undergrad degree, I can 100% tell you, kindly, no one gave a shit about that. I could quote Shakespeare from memory, and I still can. However, that was a strange and useless qualification when it came to applying for jobs, as I so richly discovered. My solution was simply to return to school and never leave, which is why I'm still here. I don't know that that's a solution that everyone can take advantage of, however. I am a unicorn, as it were. Okay, 1 minute. 1 minute? No minutes on my watch. All right, let me see where we're at. We'll finish up on Monday. We'll do a couple more practice questions. I'm not far from being done. I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slides left. I'll finish those 5 slides on Monday. That won't take me long. Have a great weekend. We'll talk a little bit more exam on Monday. I promise it's not super scary, and we will go from there. Okay. Of course. Hang on, let me turn off my recording. Last time I forgot, and the recording is like 4 hours long.
An hour 13.
What's that?
An hour 13.
Okay. I was like, I got home and I'm like, oh,